All right, this session is The Voice of Data and Gender Equality, and it is Saara Romu, the Senior Program Officer from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Saara builds global partnerships that leverage innovative models, technology, and new approaches for impact on some of the greatest global challenges today. Thank you, Saara.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I've been told that I need to speak straight or to the right because of what I chose to wear today. So hopefully I won't fade out too much. Good, it's up there. So I'm a senior program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I've been with the foundation for 8 years. And most recently, I started working with a team that we're building around gender equality. Part of the reason for this team is part of the tenets, one of the tenets that we have for our organization, which is all lives have equal value. One of the other tenets that we have is everyone should have the chance to live a healthy and productive life. So a little bit about our organization. We have a global presence. We have a little bit under 2,000 grantees. This is old data, as you'll see 2014 on there, but it's pretty consistent year over year. We spend around $4 billion every year in grant making, and then we're actually down, reducing our number of employees. So we have about 1,300 employees globally. We have a global presence. Our head office is down the street. You may have seen us across from the Space Needle. We have an office in DC, London, a few offices in Sub-Saharan Africa, India, and China as well. A little bit about our history. We actually originally started in 1994. We officially started in 2000. In 1994, it was Bill Sr. at a table in his basement writing checks in response to personal letters. In 2000, it officially launched. We built the new building that you see today in 2011. And we have a visitor center there, so everyone is welcome to come and visit and learn more about our mission. With our mission, we sort of have 4 key tenets of what we call what we do. We ensure more children and young people survive and thrive. We combat infectious diseases, particularly those that affect the poorest. We inspire people to take action to change the world, and we empower the poorest, especially women and girls, to transform their lives. And part of this is around back to the tenet that all lives have equal value, learning that through our work of gender equality that this is really important. Globally, women and girls are predominantly the most vulnerable groups. It's also been recognized that when you give to women, there's a much greater impact on the community than when you give to their male counterparts. And so from an ROI perspective, if you're thinking of your return on investment as a development actor, it makes much more sense to invest in women and girls, not to the exclusion of men, but that it's very, very important for this work and to make advances in this work in reduction of poverty. So I personally have been tasked with working on gender data. So May of last year, Melinda made a commitment at the Women Deliver Conference. She committed $80 million towards women and girls, specifically around gender data and advocacy. One of the things, and so I was asked to do the grant making for that. One of the things that we know is that we don't know a lot of information about women. Usually what you don't necessarily value as much as other things, you don't necessarily track or have as much information on. And so we really see that as sort of one of the first steps in the process. When I say gender data to people kind of, it's like a deer in headlights sometimes. They're like, what? And there's obviously, gender data is seen through a different lens, and it really depends on the context. So I'll share some of the things that you might have been exposed to that are more sort of Northern Hemisphere or North America focused, and then head into some of the global development stuff that we do, specifically with work in the cloud with AWS and some of the technology. So this is a study that was done by an artist looking at gender norms starting from childhood. And so she goes around to different families and she takes photos of the things that kids have in their rooms. And you'll see it's a little bit different from the left to right. One of the things that you find also is a lot of the things on the left side is it has things to do with doing and work and being active in the world, whereas a lot of the things on the right side tend to be things around caregiving and what you look like. So this is sort of an early look at an early encapsulation of data gathering around early life, particularly in North America. You may have heard about diversity in tech and some of the stuff that Melinda has spoken about. This is work actually that she does out of her own personal office over in Kirkland called Pivotal Ventures. One of the things that we found, which was also impetus for funding this initiative, was that a lot of people aren't necessarily convinced, even in the technology space, of looking around at culture and things like that. You really have to present leaders with hard data and hard facts to show them that these are issues or these are realities. So this is a quick example that she refers to pretty often, is just looking at women in different STEM occupations. And you'll see everything is kind of on a hockey stick upswing. So there's biological scientists, chemists. A lot of them actually, this ends in 2013, but they've even eclipsed the 50% mark. Engineers is still pretty low, but computer and mathematical occupations goes against this. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this. There's lower and lower enrollment rates of women in STEM. Looking at this from an international perspective, for education for STEM and gender, they did this study, and this was part of a website called No Ceilings, which Secretary Clinton had worked on for a while as well, or had supported for a while as well. And they did a study where they looked at science scores of men and women, and globally, country to country, there was absolutely no difference in measurable ability in science scores. But then when you looked at the university graduates in these different areas, there was a significant difference compared to the country that you were in. So Argentina apparently is doing pretty well. One of the groups that we've worked with as well is McKinsey. They've done a series of women in work. They come out probably, it's usually about once a year with a report on this. This is from a couple years ago. But one of the things that's really striking about this, this shows the pipeline of women as they enter the workforce and move along the chain as they mature professionally, is it shows the number of women entering is 45. The number of women actually who are available to enter, who have the credentials, who have the experience, is greater than 50%, particularly in the United States, where women, there's more and more female college graduates than men. So even before the pipeline starts, there's a reduction in women entering the professional pipeline. So it's kind of interesting. And then thinking of things a little bit globally, unpaid work. And this actually links back quite a bit to the development work and the things that I'm focused on at the foundation, that just from social norms, women are expected to do more unpaid work than men. They're expected to take care of the household, to do a lot of the caregiving, even just things like cleaning up the house. There's lots and lots of interesting tasks that women just for some reason there's an expectation out there for them to take on and do these tasks where their male counterparts won't necessarily do those tasks as well. It differs. North America actually is doing pretty good and is on a good trajectory when it comes to how that's moving. Another study that I'm very fond of, ILO and Gallup did this. They just launched it at earlier this spring. It's about a phone book in size, if you ever want to look through the report itself with the hard data. But one of the things that I loved about it is it really highlighted that the experience of women is really different across the world. And this is partially part of the reason why we've separated out how we're looking at gender equality, separate from Melinda's office looking more in North America and Northern Hemisphere things, and the foundation looking in the developing world. But you can see when it comes to attitudes around working women, and this is a survey that Gallup had done equally men and women they surveyed, so it's not just women's perspective. North America, clearly unequal pay is a big issue. Whereas in sub-Saharan Africa, it's more things around work and family balance and unfair treatment. It was interesting, actually, to see in Scandinavia that there's a lot around work and family balance as well. So, and then you can see this broken out. The challenges shift with development. So they've tracked some of these indicators over time, and they've seen that as a country becomes more and more developed, women's concern over unequal pay becomes more and more the majority of the concern, because a lot of those other concerns and disparities are reduced more significantly. So with that in mind, one of the things that we work towards, and it's so exciting to see that Amazon and AWS are working towards this as well, is the Sustainable Development Goals. We're super excited. Goal number 5 is gender equality, and we work with a lot of partners around supporting that. Of the 17 goals, there's a lot of data that needs to be collected. So there's 232 indicators. There's actually 244, but some of them overlap, and they're actually measuring the same thing in different goal buckets. With that, our partner UN Women has mapped this out across the different SDGs. And so this is a mapping showing that there's actually 10 SDGs that have different indicators that measure women and girls' lives. And you can see, particularly in SDG 5, so tier 1 are ones that we have standards, so we know what we're tracking and countries agree, okay, this is how we're gonna track towards this goal. And they're also actually actively collecting that information. Tier 2 is there's standards, but the countries actually aren't tracking that information. And then tier 3, there's no standards, and the countries definitely are not tracking that information. So unfortunately, the majority, as you can see, of information that's supposed to be gathered around gender equality is in tier 3. So there's no standards, and it's not even being tracked. So this is an area we want to have influence and we want to change. Going back again to why we feel that gender equality is so important. Again, the majority of the world's poor are women. Greater than 60% of the illiterate population are female. The majority of children who are not in school are girls. Yet we know that when you can ensure that women are educated, it changes communities drastically and lifts all boats. So health outcomes are better, economic outcomes are better, family stability is better. It creates a virtuous cycle when you have impact in these areas. When women are supported and empowered, yeah, all society benefits. And yet, right now, only 13% of countries measure gender data and gender indicators. So the countries themselves aren't even looking and creating these scorecards to see how they're measuring and how they're delivering for these women and girls. So we specifically looked at this, and we identified sort of 5 challenge areas. There's major data gaps. There's bias in measurement tools. So one of the ways that you find out what's going on in the lives of people when you don't necessarily live in North America, where there's really good administrative data, is you send out surveys. And a lot of these surveys, I was really surprised to find out, they actually ask for the head of household. So they only interview the head of household. This is changing, but a lot of times that tends to be the dude, and he doesn't necessarily know actually what's happening in that household at all. He'll answer questions from his perspective and from as best as he can, but that ends up giving us incorrect or inaccurate data. Again, another thing is fragmentation of data actors. A lot of the people who do surveys don't necessarily talk to each other. They don't make sure that the different survey tools or the different ways of gathering information are interoperable or that you can compare them to one another. Capacity constraints, National Statistics Office, so the group that does our censuses, or on a regular basis to see who's where and who's doing what. They don't actually, a lot of them have any sort of gender or training themselves, or they don't have surveys that look at, as you saw, any of the indicators or information gathering stuff around women and girls. And then finally, there's low use of gender data. So a lot of policymakers, even if this information is available, and this happens in the United States, they won't ask for the information, or if they're provided the information, they won't use it to inform their decision making. So across the data lifecycle, this is just a quick highlight of some of the issues that we found. The impact on women is that women's time is unaccounted for, women's voices are unheard. Individuals, because there's not a lot of disaggregated data, tend to become invisible. The data picture overall, as you can tell, is incomplete. And then women lack the information that they need to go to their policymakers or other implementers to hold people accountable for them and their needs. With the initiative that we've created, there's sort of 5 areas. These are capacity and coordination, building evidence. These are sort of the titles of the groups, building global momentum, filling gender data gaps, and then mainstreaming gender in major data initiatives. And this is one of the things I'm most excited about. So the foundation of the $4 billion that we give out every year, 500 million of that, give or take, are data grants. So it's around data collection, analysis, curation, advocacy, working with decision makers, training them, and things like that. And so part of my job, on top of doing all the grant making, is reaching out to all these groups, be it university groups, be it policy groups in countries, and talking to them about what they're doing around gender, and understanding what they're doing around gender, and convincing them to do things around gender and include women and girls, make sure that their data is disaggregated so you understand what's happening with women and girls. So I want to share with you a couple examples of, and sorry this has been so technical from a donor's perspective, of how we've used the cloud to do some analysis for women and girls to really look at really figure out what's the reality for them on the ground. So one of our grantees is Data2X. They're based at the UN Foundation, and we worked with them to do a big data challenge. So the first example I'll share with you was done with Flowminder Foundation or WorldPop. The person is Andy Tatum, who's based at University of Southampton. He does amazing work. We originally started working with him on polio. In northern Nigeria, it's can be considered a fragile state. For polio eradication, it's very difficult to understand what populations are actually there, where people are, and where they're moving. And so we've worked with him in the past looking at call detail records or cell phone data, satellite imagery, these massive, big amounts of data that really you can only store in the cloud and can only compute or do computational analysis in the cloud with. To understand where those populations are so we can make sure that everyone is being vaccinated with a polio vaccine. For that, though, we thought, we could probably use these tools to really understand women and girls. A lot of times people will take these big, massive things in development and apply them to what they think are more sexy causes. And so for us, we wanted people to see that you can apply this with really practical things, particularly things like female stunting. And so we worked with them to use the DHS, so the Demographic Health Survey is a survey that's done by USAID in sub-Saharan Africa, across most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And we had Andy pull the data sets for female stunting, and then he also pulled a number of other data sets. And you can see the DHS data is pretty spotty, literally. And then he used cell phone data, satellite imagery, and a couple other data sets from on-the-ground sampling, so what we call microcensus data, where we'll send out a little team and they'll do follow-up data collection so that when we run machine learning algorithms, we can verify it and validate it with up-to-date ground information. And this is what resulted. So you can see that, as to be expected, in the north, there's greater female stunting, and in the south, there's less female stunting. This has to do with where there's more fragility happening in the country. But we wanted to know if this was just all kids were experiencing stunting in the north and all kids weren't experiencing stunting, and what might be male child preference. So sometimes when a mother has more than one child, they will choose to feed the male child or provide health care for the male child. So we call it male child preference over the female children. And so we had them run further analysis, and this shows you that it's a very different picture when you're looking at the difference. So where there's greater girl child stunting versus boy child stunting, you can see that there's quite a bit in the more urban areas in the southern Nigeria, and then also on the eastern areas. And this was really helpful for us. So we had conversations with the Ministry of Health, a couple other heads of agencies who really work on the ground with on-the-care health delivery services in targeting appropriate means of changing this around. And so coming up with effective programs, actually having this as a topic of discussion for healthcare providers to try to reverse this. Another example was in Kenya, using much the same sort of data sets and computational analysis, looking at literacy. And so we had the DHS survey, which it actually ended up matching up really well. So you can see the female literacy. There was a couple pockets of surprisingly high literacy that we didn't anticipate in northern Kenya that we thought that we were very optimistically excited to see. And again, this helps us with targeting for funding, decision-making, resource allocation, so working with the ministries of education and a bunch of different NGOs and other partners on the ground in this country to be very specific, targeted, and granular in how we can respond to this. For us as well, it's important looking at things from the district level, because when you have this more granular data, then you can know which districts and what parts of districts you need to really target with different programs to be much more accurate and specific. Again, we did this with Tanzania. This was with family planning, using DHS data and use of contraceptive methods. And this was helpful, again, very similarly to the nutrition work with engaging healthcare workers. And with this as well for us, we were looking at supply chain, so where we could distribute family planning better, and where there were pockets that there wasn't as much uptake or accessibility as we would want. So another thing that we funded with some of our partners was some work with MIT and UN Global Pulse. And they looked at massive amounts of credit card data, de-identified credit card data, so no privacy concerns, and cell phone data, again, de-identified, to really look at women's expenditure and mobility. And this was partially to work with policymakers. This was in a city in South America. We won't tell you the city for privacy as well. To really work with policymakers and help them understand the different populations that were living in their city. And they came up with 7 different populations. They found that overall women spent less on credit cards than men. They weren't able to attribute this to women having less money necessarily, or women just choosing to use credit cards less frequently. But they did find that having this disaggregated data for the policymakers was really, really useful in order for them to put planning into place for if there was any shocks. So mostly economic shocks, less environmental shocks, but if there was a need for people to access funds using credit cards, or in this case, for them to disperse funds through credit cards to their population, they would better be able to target that to the people in most need. We did a further cut of the data into the 7 groups, and so I did not label the groups. I think they're kind of a little bit random. So commuter, homemaker, youth, tech user, unlabeled, diners 1 and diners 2, and compared it to the male counterparts. So the people who were basically living in the same location, and you would assume would be the husbands or brothers of their women. The red lines are the men, and then the filled in pockets are the women. And you can see even in these sort of subgroups that they differ quite a bit in things like mobility, social diversity, the number of people that they get to interact with every day, a number of the different sort of attributes that we looked at. So this was helpful. We also provided this to the policymakers, and it had impact on how they decided to look at their populations and how to respond to their population's needs. So a third example is gender and social data. This again was UN Global Pulse and University of Leiden. And they've come up with an algorithm. Robert Kirkpatrick at UNGP loves Twitter and Twitter data. And so he came up with an algorithm because we were like, how do we know what's happening with women and what they think about stuff? And this was actually leading up to the SDGs and we wanted to understand what they thought of the different sustainable development goals, if they felt like there was enough emphasis, what they felt about SDG 5 and gender equality and some of the indicators within that and how that was being measured. And so they came up with this algorithm to look at Twitter, and they were able to identify a Twitter user's gender at 74%. They've since improved this, so they're better able to predict this. And then, see, this is a quick snap of the dashboard of tweets about equality between men and women. So you can see that was significant more conversation in certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa than other parts of sub-Saharan Africa. India had quite a bit of tweets about that as well, and certain parts of South America. Canada, slightly more than the United States. I don't know why. And Greenland as well, Iceland also. One of the things that we saw for using it as a tool going forward is looking at countries that we were thinking of investing in. For me, selfishly, as someone who's trying to figure out, okay, where is this money best spent and where would it have the greatest impact? One of the things we look at is receptivity. So if there's a certain amount of receptivity from policymakers and the population to try to help with some of this work. So they looked at Nepal, and they found that the one topic that women most often tweeted about was equality between men and women. And the topic that men most tweeted about was protecting forests, rivers, and oceans. So the way that we've approached Nepal for investment is we ourselves as an organization don't invest in the environment. So we have sort of partnered with and spoken to other groups that do invest in the environment, and we've been thinking about and having conversations about how do we connect those two of gender equality and then also these other related concerns about the environment as well, which has to connect to the livelihood of people too. Interestingly enough, they were doing, at the beginning of the study, it was during the Nepal earthquake, and they found that a lot of these tweets ended up merging. So they have this interesting graphic where it falls into all these different columns and buckets of tweet type or tweet topic. And a lot of them converged into supporting people who cannot work and an honest and responsive government. And these were also basically equally tweeted as a concern by men and women in Nepal. So it's interesting to see those patterns, and also looking at that as a tool for policymakers. Again, these are de-identified, so there's no way that they would be able to trace it back to the person who's actually originally tweeting. So finally, I just wanted to share this. This is some work that's done by Max Roser. He's a grantee who's based in Oxford. As an organization who works on some of the most difficult problems, our co-chairs refer to themselves as impatient optimists and tell us to be continually optimistic. Max has been doing work with us on looking at large data sets over time. I think this is, it starts in 1820, so it's not a huge, long amount of time, but it's when he would have access to this data from European records and estimates from other records globally. And overall, the world as a people, we're on a good trajectory and we're on a good path. So you'll see that extreme poverty is reduced significantly, basic education is up, literacy is up, child mortality is down, vaccination rates are up, democracy is up. So overall, we're very optimistic about the work that we have going forward. I've been working with him as well to try to get him to do this as disaggregated data and trying to break things out so that you can actually have a view of how things are changing for women and girls as well. So that's the overview. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, well, I'm around if you have any other questions later. Thanks.